The alarms had stopped an hour ago, but my hands were still shaking. I sat in the cold corridor of the station, my back against a metal wall that still hummed from the ceasefire signal, and I stared at my own fingers like they belonged to someone else. Around me, the wreck of the last few days sat frozen in place. Broken chairs, a cracked window looking out at the dark, the smell of burnt wiring that never really goes away once you have smelled it. 3 days ago, we were told to stand down, not to win, not to lose, just to stop. A truce, the first real one in longer than I could remember. I did not trust it. Nobody in my unit trusted it. But orders are orders, and so here I was, sitting on a neutral station somewhere between our territory and theirs, waiting for talks I was not part of and did not want to be part of. That was when she found me. I heard her before I saw her. A soft, even step, nothing like the heavy boots of my own people. When she turned the corner, I straightened without meaning to. Old habits do not care about ceasefires. She was tall, taller than me by a good measure, with pale gray skin that seemed to catch the low light of the corridor and hold it. Her eyes were large, dark, and steady, the kind of eyes that looked like they were always calculating something. She wore the deep blue coat of a Valari officer, the insignia of a rank I did not recognize stitched along the collar. The Valari. My enemy for as long as I had worn a uniform. I stood up straight, one hand resting near my side out of instinct, though I carried no weapon here. Neutral ground, no weapons allowed. My body had not gotten the message yet. She stopped a few paces away and studied me the way you might study a puzzle that refused to make sense. "You are one of the humans," she said. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, with a strange rhythm to it, like she was translating each word carefully before she spoke it. "Guilty as charged," I said, though I doubted the humor would land. It did not. She tilted her head slightly, the way I had seen Valari do when they were processing something outside their expectations. "I have a question," she said. "If you will permit it." I almost laughed. Here we were, two soldiers from two sides that had been trying to end each other for years, standing in a hallway with no weapons, and she wanted permission to ask a question. "Go ahead," I said. "Doubt I have anywhere else to be." She stepped closer, and for a moment, I saw something in her face that I did not expect. Not hatred, not the cold detachment I had always been told the Valari carried into everything. Something closer to confusion. Real confusion, the kind that keeps a person awake at night. "Why," she said slowly, "do you keep fighting?" I blinked at her. "That's it? That's the question?" "That is the question," she said. "I have studied your species since the war began. I have read your histories, your strategies, your losses. By every measure my people use, this conflict should have ended a long time ago. Your resources are a fraction of ours. Your numbers are smaller. Your worlds have been damaged in ways that should have made peace the only sensible outcome seasons ago." She paused, and her dark eyes held mine without blinking. "And yet you do not stop," she said. "You keep going, even when the numbers say you cannot win. Even when surrender would cost you almost nothing compared to what continued conflict costs you. I do not understand it. I have run the simulations myself. There is no logical model of your behavior that makes sense to me." I did not answer right away, not because I did not have an answer, but because I had about a dozen of them, and none of them felt true enough to say out loud. "You want the truth?" I finally said, "or you want the answer that sounds good in a report?" Something shifted in her expression. It was small, but I caught it. Interest. Genuine interest. "The truth," she said. "I did not come here for a report. I came here because I could not stop thinking about it." I studied her for a long moment. Officers on her side did not usually wander off alone to ask questions like this. Not to us. Not without an agenda, or so I had always been told. But there was nothing in her posture that looked like a trap. She stood there, patient, waiting, like the answer actually mattered to her. I glanced past her shoulder, down the corridor, at the dark window and the stars beyond it. Somewhere out there, were the wrecks of ships from both our sides, drifting in the space between the systems we had been fighting over. Somewhere out there were people from her side and mine who were not coming home. "You want to know why we keep fighting?" I said quietly, "even when it doesn't make sense on paper." "Yes," she said, "even when giving up would probably be safer, in the short term." "Yes," she said again, and I noticed she had not blinked in a while. I let out a slow breath, the kind that comes from somewhere deep in the chest, the kind that carries more weight than the air it releases. "That's not a short answer," I said. "You sure you have time for it?" She looked around the empty corridor, at the frozen ceasefire clock ticking down on the wall behind her, counting the hours until the talks resumed, and people like her and people like me would go back to being enemies with paperwork instead of enemies with weapons. "I have time," she said. "I would like to understand." I nodded slowly, and something in me, something tired and worn thin by years of losing friends to a war that never seemed to end, decided that maybe it was worth trying to explain it. Not for her sake, not even for mine, maybe just because somebody, somewhere, should finally hear the truth instead of the version we tell ourselves to sleep at night. "My name's Daniel," I said, holding out a hand I was not sure she would understand the meaning of. She looked at it for a moment, then extended her own longer fingers, wrapping carefully around mine in a gesture that felt practiced, like she had studied the custom without ever using it. "Vesa," she said, "of the Valari Fourth Fleet." "All right, Vesa," I said. "You asked for the truth. Let's start with why the easy answers are all wrong." She sat down across from me on the cold floor of the corridor, her long coat pooling around her like dark water, and for the first time since the fighting had started years ago, I found myself talking to the enemy not as a soldier, but as a person trying to explain something that even I had never said out loud before. "You're going to want to write this down," I said, "because I don't think anyone's ever told you the real version." "I am listening," she said. And so I began. "The first answer people give," I said, "is that we fight for freedom. That's the one you'll hear in every speech, every recruitment message, every history lesson back home. We fight because we refuse to live under someone else's control." Vesa tilted her head. "That is not a foolish answer." "No," I agreed, "but it's not the whole truth either. Because your people have taken systems before. I've read the reports, same as you probably have read ours. Some of those systems, once they were under Valari control, lived fine. Better food distribution, better medical care in some cases, less conflict between their own factions because you enforced order from above." "That is correct," she said. "Many systems flourished under our governance." "Right. So if freedom alone was the reason, some of our worlds should have taken that deal and been glad of it. Better order, more stability, fewer casualties. But we didn't. Entire colonies chose to fight even when surrender meant an easier life. That doesn't fit if freedom is the only reason." She considered this for a moment, her fingers moving slightly against the fabric of her coat, a habit I would come to recognize as her version of deep thought. "Then perhaps it is survival," she offered. "Your species fears extinction. That is a rational basis for continued conflict." "Closer," I said, "but still not it. Because we've fought wars, real wars, back on Earth long before any of you existed to us, where surrender was absolutely survivable. There were times entire nations could have given up, lived on under whoever conquered them, kept their homes, kept their families, and just accepted a new flag over their heads. Some did, but plenty didn't. Plenty fought battles they had almost no chance of winning, against enemies stronger in every measurable way, and lost most of their people doing it." "That sounds like poor strategy," Vesa said, and I could hear no judgment in it, only honest confusion. "By your standards, maybe," I said. "By ours, it's something else entirely." I looked down the corridor again, at the dim emergency lighting flickering along the ceiling, casting long shadows that stretched and shrank with every pulse. "Let me tell you about a battle," I said, "early in this war, before you and I ever set foot on a ship." Vesa straightened slightly, and I saw her attention sharpen, the way a predator focuses just before it moves. There was a colony called Ashwell, I said. A small settlement, agricultural mostly, maybe 40,000 people. When your fleet arrived there, 3 years into the war, our defense forces were already stretched thin. Command ran the numbers. Local resistance had maybe 6 ships against your 20. No support fleet close enough to help in time. Every simulation said the same thing. Full retreat, save what people we could, abandon the colony, live to fight another day. That would have been the correct decision, Vesa said. That's what command thought too, I said. They sent the order. Retreat and evacuate. I paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough for her to lean in slightly. They refused, I said. The 6 ships stationed there. Every single crew. They sent back a single message to command, and then they held position anyway. Why would they disobey a direct order that would have saved their lives? Because retreating meant leaving 40,000 civilians behind with maybe an hour of warning before your fleet reached the surface, I said. There wasn't enough transport capacity to get everyone out in time. Somebody was going to be left behind no matter what, and those 6 crews decided that if somebody had to stay, it wasn't going to be the ones with weapons. Vesa did not respond right away. Her dark eyes held a stillness I had not seen in her before, like she was replaying the scenario in her mind, running it through every strategic model she had ever learned, trying to find the version where this decision made sense. They lost, I said quietly. All 6 ships, every crew member. But they held your fleet back long enough for evacuation transports to get 31,000 people off that colony before the ground assault began. 9,000 were lost, she said, and I noticed something in her voice that had not been there a moment ago. Not detachment, something closer to weight. 9,000, I agreed, and by every calculation your people or mine could run, that was still a failure, a costly, bloody failure that cost 6 full crews and left a hole in our defense line that took months to repair. Then I do not understand why you tell me this story as if it were a victory. Because it wasn't about the number, I said. It was about what those crews decided in the moment they had to choose. They knew the fight was unwinnable. They knew the mathematics said retreat, and they stayed anyway, because retreating meant deciding that some lives were worth less than others, and none of them could live with making that call. Vesa was quiet for a long moment, her hands folded now in her lap, her posture unusually still for someone I had only known a few minutes, but who had already struck me as someone who moved with constant, careful precision. My people do not fight this way, she said finally. When the calculations turn against us, we withdraw. It is not considered a failure, it is considered wisdom. A commander who continues an unwinnable engagement is removed from command, not honored. I know, I said. I've seen it happen. Whole Valari fleets pulling back the moment the numbers shift, even mid-battle, even when a little more effort might have turned things around. Your people treat retreat as intelligence. We treat it as something closer to betrayal, in the moments that matter most. That seems needlessly costly, she said. It is, I said. I'm not going to sit here and tell you it's smart. Plenty of good people have died because somebody decided the fight was worth continuing when it clearly wasn't. I've buried friends because of decisions like that. I'm not proud of every version of this story. Then why does your species continue to make that choice? I looked at her, this tall gray officer from a species that had been trying to end mine for years, sitting across from me on a cold floor with more genuine curiosity in her eyes than I had seen from most of my own commanding officers in a long time. Because somewhere along the way, I said, we decided that giving up guarantees a loss, but fighting only ever guarantees a chance, even a small one, even a stupid one, and for reasons I'm not sure even we fully understand, that chance has always mattered more to us than the odds against it. Vesa's fingers tightened slightly against the fabric of her coat. That is not a rational answer, she said, but there was no accusation in it, only observation. No, I agreed. It probably isn't. Then help me understand it anyway, she said, because I have spent years trying to model your species using logic, and every model breaks apart the same way. I want to know what I am missing. I thought about Ashwell again. About the 6 ships that never came home. About the message they sent back to command before they held their position. A message I had read more times than I could count. 4 simple words that had somehow ended up carved into a memorial wall on a colony I had never even visited. We are not leaving. It's not something you can model with numbers, I said slowly. It's something older than strategy. Older than any war either of our species has ever fought. If you want to understand it, I have to go back further than Ashwell. I have to go back to where it started, long before either of us was born. Vesa did not move, did not blink, simply waited, the way someone waits when they have finally found the beginning of an answer they have been chasing for a very long time. Then go back, she said. I am not leaving either. I almost smiled at that, the echo of it, though I doubted she meant it the way it landed on me. All right, I said. Let's talk about where humans actually come from, not the polished version. The real one. Vesa shifted slightly, settling in like someone preparing for a long lesson, though nothing about her posture suggested boredom. If anything, she looked more alert than before. Our homeworld tried to kill us more times than I can count, I said. Long before we ever built a ship, long before we ever left our own solar system, we were just another species clinging to survival on a planet that did not care whether we lived or died. Every world is indifferent to the species that evolve on it, Vesa said. That is not unique to your history. Maybe not, I said, but most species that face enough hardship early on simply die out. We almost did, more than once. There were times our entire population dropped so low that a single disaster could have ended us completely. Disease, cold periods that lasted longer than anyone alive could remember the world being warm. Famine that lasted generations. We should have disappeared quietly, the way most fragile species do. And yet you did not. No, I said. We didn't. And here's the strange part. It wasn't because we were the strongest creatures around. We weren't. Plenty of animals could outrun us, outfight us, survive harsher conditions than we could. What we had instead was something harder to explain, a refusal. Somewhere in our early history, something in us decided that dying quietly was not an option, even when every condition around us said it should have been the only option. Vesa's eyes narrowed slightly, not in hostility, but in the focused way of someone trying to fit new information into a framework that kept resisting it. You are describing instinct, she said. All species have survival instinct. Sure, I said, but most species stop pushing once the cost outweighs the benefit. That's basic biology. You don't spend energy fighting a battle you clearly cannot win, because the smart move is to conserve what you have and try again later. Most animals understand that intuitively. Humans, for whatever reason, developed a habit of pushing past that point, again and again, throughout our entire history. I let the silence sit for a moment before continuing. I'll give you an example older than any war we fought against your people, I said. There was a time on Earth when an illness spread across almost the entire world. No cure, no real understanding of what caused it. People were dying in numbers that seem impossible now, filling graves faster than they could be dug. By any reasonable measure, there should have been despair so complete that entire regions simply collapsed. And did they? Some did, I admitted. I won't pretend it was some universal triumph. There was real suffering, real loss, entire communities that never recovered the way they had been before. But even in the middle of that, there were people who kept working. Doctors who kept treating patients even though they had no cure to offer, knowing they themselves might not survive the exposure. People who kept showing up to help strangers they had never met, for no reward except knowing they had tried. Not because they thought it would definitely save anyone, because giving up completely was somehow worse than the risk of trying. That is admirable, Vesa said slowly, but admirable is not the same as logical. You keep waiting for me to give you a logical answer, I said. I don't think I have one. I think that's the whole point. She was quiet again, and this time the silence lasted longer. I watched her process, watched the careful way her fingers moved against each other, like she was working through calculations that refused to balance. On my homeworld, she said finally, we learned very early that conflict without clear advantage is wasteful. Our ancestors who survived best were the ones who recognized unwinnable situations quickly and withdrew before losses became severe. Over generations, this became not just strategy but instinct. It is woven into how we think, how we plan, how we fight. When the numbers turn against us, withdrawal is not a failure of will, it is simply the correct response, and every part of our culture reinforces that truth. That makes sense, I said. I'm not saying your way is wrong. I imagine it's kept your people alive plenty of times when continuing to fight would have destroyed you completely. It has, she said. Our history includes very few last stands of the kind you describe at Ashwell. When our forces recognize an engagement cannot be won, they withdraw, regroup, and return when conditions favor us. It has served us well for longer than your species has existed. I believe you, I said, but I think that's exactly why you can't model us. Because you're trying to understand humanity using a framework built entirely around knowing when to stop, and we built our entire history around not knowing how to. Vessa's head tilted again, that same gesture of processing something new. Explain further, she said. All right, I said. Think about it from a different direction. Your people surrender when the numbers turn, and it costs you nothing in terms of reputation. Nobody thinks less of a commander who orders a withdrawal at the right moment. It's considered wise. Correct. For us, historically, that same decision often meant something different. There have been moments in our past where surrender, even the smart, survivable kind, meant something was lost that could never be rebuilt. Not just lives, something less tangible. The story a people told about who they were. Once you convince yourselves that giving up is always the smarter choice, it becomes easier to give up the next time and the time after that, until eventually giving up is simply what your people do whenever things get hard. You are suggesting that continued resistance, even when costly, prevents a kind of cultural erosion. Maybe, I said, or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe it's just that somewhere very early in our history, in some cave, on some cold night, with no food and no real chance the winter would end kindly, somebody decided they were not going to lie down and die quietly. And that decision got passed down, not through any book or law, but through something quieter, something that lived in how parents raised their children, how leaders inspired their people, how stories got told around fires long before anyone could write them down. Vessa did not respond immediately. I watched her gaze drift toward the dark window at the end of the corridor, toward the distant, cold light of stars neither of our species had any real claim to. There is a story among my people as well, she said quietly. From very early in our history, before we understood the value of strategic withdrawal, a group of our ancestors held a position against overwhelming odds and did not retreat, though every one of our elders since has called it a foolish decision. They were destroyed completely. It is remembered as a warning, not an example to follow. What happened to them exactly? They defended a settlement against a natural disaster that could not be fought, only endured or fled, she said. They chose to stay and protect those too weak to travel, rather than save themselves. They did not survive. My people study this event as proof that emotional attachment to a losing position leads only to unnecessary loss. I felt something tighten in my chest at that, something unexpected. We'd call that the same thing I told you about Ashwell, I said quietly. Vessa looked at me, and for the first time since our conversation began, I saw something shift behind her dark eyes. Not agreement, not yet, but something had cracked open, just slightly, a door that had been sealed for longer than either of us had been alive. Are you suggesting, she said slowly, that this event in our history is not a failure, but an example of the same instinct you describe in your own species? I'm suggesting, I said, that maybe your people have it too, buried deep, mostly trained out of you by generations of choosing the smarter path. But maybe it's still there, somewhere underneath all that logic. And maybe that's exactly why this story still gets told, instead of being forgotten the way most failed strategies eventually are. Vesa said nothing for a long moment. The ceasefire clock behind her ticked steadily, counting down toward talks that would resume soon, talks that would decide whether our two species kept trying to destroy each other or found some way to stop. "I did not come here expecting to feel unsettled," she said finally. "Neither did I admitted. "But you asked for the truth. I haven't even gotten to the real answer yet." She straightened slightly, her attention sharpened once more. "Then continue," she said. "I want to hear all of it." I took a slow breath, the kind you take before saying something you have never actually said out loud before, not even to yourself. "All right," I said. "Here it is, the real answer. Not the one from speeches, not the one from history lessons, not even the one from the story about Ashwell, the truth underneath all of it." Vesa did not move. She simply waited, giving me the kind of stillness that made it easier to speak. "Humanity doesn't fight because we expect to win," I said. "That's the part nobody says out loud, because it sounds reckless when you say it plainly. We fight because somewhere back in our history, long before anyone alive today was born, we learned something simple and brutal. Giving up guarantees the loss. Every single time. There's no version of surrender that leaves the door open. But fighting, even when the odds are terrible, even when every calculation says it's hopeless, fighting always leaves a chance, a small one. Sometimes a chance so small it barely counts as a chance at all, but it exists. And for us, that tiny sliver of possibility has always outweighed the certainty of losing." Vesa's fingers had gone still against her coat. "That is an enormous risk to take repeatedly," she said. "Across your entire history." "It is," I agreed. "And it's cost us more than I think either of us has time to talk through tonight. Whole nations lost to wars that could have been avoided. People who died holding a line that, in hindsight, made no strategic sense to hold. I'm not going to sit here and tell you it was always the right call. Plenty of times it wasn't. Plenty of good people paid for decisions that, looking back, were driven by pride more than wisdom. Then why do you still defend this instinct? Because the same instinct that got people killed at the wrong moments is the same one that's kept our entire species alive at the right ones," I said. "You can't separate them. They come from the same place. The same refusal to accept an ending just because the math says it's coming." I looked at her steadily, wanting her to understand this next part clearly, because it mattered more than anything else I had said so far. "This war," I said, "the one you and I have both been fighting for years now. You've read the reports. You know what's actually at stake for us, even if your command hasn't said it plainly in the negotiations." "I know the surface terms," she said carefully. "Territorial boundaries, resource allocation, withdrawal from contested systems." "That's the version they've told your negotiators," I said. "Here's the version we know on our side. If we accept the terms your fleet offered 2 years ago, the ones that looked so reasonable on paper, we don't just lose territory, we lose access to every world capable of sustaining agriculture at scale. Every single one currently under dispute happens to be a world we can actually grow food on, long-term, without importing everything from systems too far away to defend properly." Vesa's expression shifted, something calculating moving behind her eyes. "That was never stated in the terms." "It wouldn't be," I said. "Your negotiators aren't lying to you. They probably don't even know. It's not written anywhere as a stated goal. It's just a consequence buried in the numbers, one that our analysts caught almost immediately, and yours likely never had reason to look for. Accept those terms, and in 2 generations, maybe 3, humanity is dependent entirely on supply lines that could be cut the moment your people decided to finish what this war started. You are saying the acceptable terms were never actually acceptable. I'm saying they were designed by people who understood strategy and resources perfectly well, and never once considered whether a species might choose to fight rather than slowly starve on a schedule nobody bothered to make visible," I said. So when Command told our fleets to hold those systems, no matter the cost, it wasn't pride. It wasn't stubbornness for its own sake. It was the same instinct I've been describing this whole time. Surrender guaranteed a slow, certain loss. Continued resistance was the only path that left any chance at all, even a narrow one, of keeping something we could not survive without. Vesa sat in silence for a long moment, and I watched something happen behind her eyes that I had not expected to see. Not disagreement, not even confusion anymore. Something closer to genuine unease. The look of someone realizing a structure they had trusted completely had a crack running straight through its foundation. "I do not know if this is wisdom," she said quietly, "or something closer to a flaw your species has never corrected because it has happened to serve you often enough to survive." "Honestly," I said, "I don't know either. I've stopped trying to decide which one it is. Maybe it's both. Maybe every species has some deep pattern buried in how they respond to danger, something that isn't fully logical, something that gets passed down whether it makes sense or not, and maybe ours just happens to be this. Keep going, even when it hurts, even when the numbers say stop, even when giving up would be so much easier." "Your species could have avoided so much loss," she said, and there was something almost mournful in the way she said it, an emotion I had not expected to hear from someone raised entirely on calculated withdrawal and rational strategy. "We could have," I agreed. "And maybe someday we'll learn to fight smarter instead of just harder. I hope we do. I've buried too many friends to pretend this instinct is something to be proud of, without question. But right now, in this war, with what's actually at stake for us, I don't think giving up was ever really an option, no matter how reasonable it looked from the outside." Vesa looked down at her hands, then back up at me, and for the first time since she had approached me in this corridor, I saw something that looked almost like understanding settle into her expression, even if it was still tangled up with disbelief. "You are telling me," she said slowly, "that an entire species has built its survival around the willingness to endure a small chance of success, rather than accept a guaranteed, survivable loss. That's about the shape of it," I said. "And you cannot say with certainty whether this makes your species remarkable," she said, "or simply fortunate that this instinct has not yet led to your complete destruction." "No," I said honestly. "I can't say that with certainty. Maybe someday it will. Maybe this exact instinct is what finally ends us, in some war neither of us can see coming yet. But so far, it's the reason we're still here to have this conversation instead of a footnote in someone else's history." The ceasefire clock behind her ticked forward, closer now to the hour when both our sides would return to the negotiation table, back to being representatives of species locked in conflict rather than two people sitting on a cold floor trying to understand something neither of us fully understood ourselves. Vesa rose slowly to her feet, smoothing her coat with careful, deliberate movements, though her eyes never left mine. "I asked you for the truth," she said. "I did not expect it to be this difficult to accept." "Most truths worth hearing usually are," I said, standing as well, my knees stiff from sitting too long on cold metal flooring. She studied me for a long moment, something working behind her calm exterior that I could not fully read. "I do not know what I will report to my command," she said quietly. "There is no framework in our doctrine for an enemy that fights not because they believe they will win, but because they cannot accept the alternative." "Then maybe that's the first thing your doctrine's been missing," I said. She did not respond to that, not directly. Instead, she turned toward the corridor leading back to the negotiation chambers, pausing only once, her hand resting briefly against the doorframe. "Thank you," she said, "for the truth, even the parts that were difficult to hear." "Thank you for actually wanting to understand," I said. "Most people on either side stopped asking a long time ago." She left without another word, her footsteps fading down the corridor, leaving me alone again with the hum of the station and the slow countdown of the ceasefire clock, and a strange, hollow feeling in my chest that I could not quite name. I did not see Vesa again that day. The talks resumed a few hours later, and I was ushered back toward the human quarters of the station, away from the negotiation chambers where people with far more authority than me argued over borders and resources, and the fine print of a peace neither side fully believed in yet. I spent that evening in a small room with a narrow window, watching the slow drift of wreckage still visible in the distance, remnants of ships from both sides that the ceasefire had frozen in place like a held breath. I thought about what I had told her. I thought about whether it was wisdom or simply the story we told ourselves to make sense of all the loss. I still did not have an answer. I am not sure I ever will. 3 days later, the talks concluded. Word moved quickly through the station, the way it always does when something important has happened, and nobody quite knows how to explain it properly yet. The terms had changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that would satisfy anyone completely, but enough. The agricultural systems humanity depended on were no longer part of the transfer. Something had shifted in the Valari position, something nobody on our side of the table could fully account for. I did not know if it was Vesa. Nobody told me directly, and I never asked, but I noticed, reading through the summary reports later, a small addition to the negotiation record. A note, attributed to a Valari officer whose name I recognized immediately, recommending further study into what she called non-standard resistance behavior among adversarial species facing existential resource loss. It was clinical, careful, the kind of language her people used to describe things they did not yet fully understand but were no longer willing to dismiss. I found her again on the day the fleets prepared to withdraw from the neutral station, each side heading back toward their own territory, carrying whatever peace we had managed to build in those few days back to people who would judge it harshly no matter what shape it took. She was standing near a viewport overlooking the drifting wreckage, her hands folded behind her back, watching the slow tumble of broken hulls catch the distant light of a star neither of our peoples owned. "Vesa," I said, coming to stand beside her. She turned slightly, acknowledging me with a small nod, before returning her gaze to the window. "Daniel," she said, "I did not expect to see you again before departure." "Wanted to say thank you," I said, "for whatever you did back there. I don't know exactly what happened in those final talks, but the terms changed, and I have a feeling you had something to do with that." "I presented an alternative analysis to my command," she said carefully, "based on information you shared with me. I explained that the previous terms carried a hidden cost that our own negotiators had not accounted for, and that pursuing them would likely result in continued indefinite resistance rather than the peaceful transition our command anticipated. "That's a very careful way of saying you told them we'd rather die than accept it," I said. "It was the accurate way of saying it," she replied, and I caught something almost like the ghost of humor in her tone, subtle enough that I might have imagined it. We stood together for a while, watching the wreckage drift silently outside the viewport, remnants of both our histories tangled together in the same slow orbit. "I have been thinking about our conversation since it ended," she said eventually. "I do not fully understand your species. Even now, I do not think I ever will, not completely, but I understand something I did not before." "What's that?" "That your instinct to continue, even against overwhelming odds, is not simply recklessness," she said. "It is not something your species does thoughtlessly. It comes from somewhere old, somewhere that has shaped every part of who you are, whether it serves you well or poorly in any single moment. My people withdraw because our history taught us that survival depends on recognizing losing positions early. Your people continue because your history taught you that surrender guarantees an ending, and endings are the one thing your species has always refused to accept quietly." I looked at her, this officer from a species that had fought mine for years, standing beside me now not as an enemy in that moment, but as someone who had genuinely tried to understand something most people, on either side, never bothered to ask about. "I don't know if we're right to think that way," I said honestly. "I've buried too many people because of it to call it a virtue without hesitation, but I don't think we can unlearn it either. Not completely. It's woven into too much of who we are." "Perhaps that is true of every species," she said quietly. some instinct too deep to fully reason away, no matter how advanced our strategies become. We stood there a while longer, the silence between us comfortable in a way I would not have thought possible days earlier. "What happens now?" I asked eventually. "Between your people and mine?" "I do not know," she said. "The ceasefire holds for now. Whether it becomes something lasting depends on decisions far above either of our ranks. But I intend to submit a full account of our conversation to my command, not simply the tactical implications, all of it. I believe understanding your species properly requires more than strategic analysis. It requires understanding what you are willing to endure, and why. That might be the first honest report either side has written about this war," I said. "Perhaps," she said. "It will not be well received by everyone. Some among my people will call it an unnecessary indulgence in sentiment rather than useful analysis." "Let them," I said. "You asked because you actually wanted to understand. That's more than most people manage, on either side of this war." She turned to face me fully then, her dark eyes steady, searching mine for a long moment before she spoke again. "You said something during our conversation that I have not been able to set aside," she said. "That your species does not fight because you believe you will win, but because you have never known any other way to remain yourselves." "I remember saying something like that," I said. "I believe I understand it now," she said. "Not as strategy, not as doctrine, simply as truth. Your species keeps fighting, Daniel, not because the odds favor you, but because giving up has never once felt like living to your people, even when it would be safer, even when it would cost less. You have decided, across your entire history, that a small chance taken is worth more than a certain loss accepted quietly." I felt something settle in my chest, hearing her say it back to me, plain and clear, stripped of all the hesitation I had carried while explaining it the first time. "Yeah," I said quietly, "that's about the truth of it." The station's departure signal echoed softly through the corridor behind us, calling both our fleets back to their separate paths, back toward an uncertain peace that neither of us could guarantee would last. Vesa extended her hand once more, the same careful, practiced gesture from days earlier, and I took it without hesitation this time. "I hope we do not meet again as enemies," she said. "Me too," I said, "but if we do, at least you'll understand why we won't be the ones to stop first." She held my hand a moment longer than necessary, something unreadable passing behind her dark eyes, before she finally released it and turned toward her own ship waiting beyond the docking corridor. I watched her go, this officer from a species built on knowing when to walk away, carrying with her the one truth her doctrine had never accounted for. Humanity does not fight because we expect to win. We fight because somewhere in our bones, long before any of us were born, we decided that giving up guarantees the loss, but fighting always leaves a chance. And for a species that clawed its way up from nothing, through every disaster that should have ended us, a chance has always been worth taking, no matter how small, no matter how costly, no matter how many times the numbers said otherwise. She asked me why we keep fighting. I told her the truth, and even now, watching her ship pull away into the dark, I still do not know if that truth makes us wise, or simply the last species standing who never learned when to stop. Maybe it is both. Maybe it always was.